in regards to the Black Lives Matter thing. So there's, I, re- I mean, I know why they've called themselves Black Lives Matter because it's the name is incredibly powerful, right? Because no one disagrees with the statement, no one disagrees with the slogan itself. However, Black Lives Matter (BLM) is an organization, and some people may not know this. There's a difference between BLM, Black Lives Matter, the organization and the different chapters that they have, and someone just saying the sentence or the slogan, Black Lives Matter, or perhaps putting it on a sign without necessarily representing the organization. So in hindsight, I clearly could have worded the tweet that I put out there more carefully. I did clarify it in a second one. But I was saying that the organization itself is not what it says on the tin, right? It's not simply, okay, we are trying to save Black lives, or we are working against injustices or, you know, racial inequities, anything like that. That can be a part of it, and that's the sort of Trojan horse that they're using for the rest of it. But there's some very bizarre parts of the ideology in there. The people who founded it, the people who promote it, it's run by some pretty radical Black women in America. And there are things in there about, you know, wanting to dismantle capitalism, wanting to disrupt the nuclear family structure, wanting to defund and ultimately abolish the police. There's all three of those, which are very, very bad ideas, and which would, in fact, probably disproportionately affect Black American communities. And then there's also, not strictly on their website, but from a lot of the people in that organization, there's also a lot of race baiting, a lot of anti-white rhetoric, a lot of, you know, it's pretty Marxist stuff in reality. And what they've done is they've sort of taken that ideology and those views and called themselves a title that no one can argue with. So if you criticize Black Lives Matter, people are like, oh my gosh, but it's called Black Lives Matter. You know, it would be like, I don't know, if I ever created a terrorist organization, I'd call it the, you know, Peace, Love, and Harmony or something.
Don't kick puppies.
Don't kick puppies. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's I mean, I see straight through stuff like that, and I think as someone who does and who looks into these things in detail, I can miscommunicate with people because I almost assume accidentally that other people kind of have my eye and my brain to see through the matrix a little bit and go beyond what the slogan is and see what's going on behind here, because I think it's quite insidious. And and also in terms of the BLM as the organization, also it's largely a vehicle to fund Democratic presidential candidates in the U.S. as well. So if you go and you donate to them, it takes you to a website called Act Blue, which is a company and website where if you trace the donations, it's, you know, the donations often go to, you know, Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg and all the Democratic candidates, et cetera. So in that sense, it's even more dodgy that they're getting these donations, tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars, by the way. I think, you know, this is not even a conspiracy theory. I think George Soros himself put $100 million into BLM. And yeah, it's just not what people think it is, at least as the organization. So people need to parse those out, but they've intentionally made it very difficult to do by calling the name something very noble. And I don't think we can underestimate the power of slogans. Slogans this is something I've always known that slogans are important, but in the past few months, I'm kind of like, wow, people are really, like, no one was talking defund the police 2 weeks ago. Now defund the police is like it's like a catchphrase. Really, defund the police, defund it. And it's just weird how people, what did I say the other day? How did I word it? Something like, human beings are herd animals who believe we are individualists, which is really the case. You know, I think that the vast majority of people, all of us to some degree have some element of herd mentality, but I think that the people who sort of stand outside of that and don't kind of just get swept up in the wave of it, which I believe includes everybody here, we're actually the minority. You know, that's something I've really learned. It's a minority position. And so, yeah, I think the slogans have been super duper powerful. It's extremely opportunistic because they seem to pop up every every election year. 2016 gets big, 2020 gets big. And one of my biggest criticisms of the movement of BLM is the fact that they focus on 0.001% of Black lives. So it's funny because if I criticize BLM, someone will try to suggest that either I'm racist or I'm caping for racists or something. And one of my biggest criticisms of them is, why do you only care about Black lives when they are killed by a white police officer in dubious circumstances, right? If the movement is going to be called Black Lives Matter, why is all the focus on the 0.001% of Black people who are killed in a very certain specific way at a specific time by a specific type of person, right? Why can't we talk about the wider issue, right? Why aren't we talking about homicide is the biggest killer of Black American males who are under 40, I believe, right? And that's only true for that demographic, right? Homicide is the biggest killer. So what can we have a conversation about that? Like, can we, if it's Black Lives Matter, can we talk about that whole thing? Can we talk about even nutrition and diet and people dying of heart disease and diabetes? Like, why can't we talk about the whole thing? Why are we only talking about it in these very, very specific scenarios? I also think that if you wanted to solve the police brutality issue and you wanted to stop these unjust police killings, and I differ from a lot of people on this one. I've spoken with friends, family about this, and I don't think everybody understands or agrees with my position on this, but I think you need to widen the scope, right? Some people say, okay, they want to do Black Lives Matter because they want to focus on that specific demographic first. But it's like, look, the majority of people killed by police in the US are not Black, right? And people will say, yeah, but it's disproportionate to the population. But I'm like, yes, but overall, only 25 to 30% of these police killings are Black victims. So this is clearly not just, sure, there can be a racial bias problem here, but it's clearly not just this narrative of the police are riding around in the USA, hunting down, lynching Black people. Like some people are trying to say, you can't go outside your house without fearing for your life, all that really hyperbolic emotional stuff, which I'm no fan of, because I think it distorts it and it prevents people from finding actual solutions. I mean, it's interesting with this George Floyd case, because there was a case a few years ago with a white man called Tony Timpa, who died in a very, very, very similar situation. No media outrage, no protests, no rioting, no looting, nobody, to this day, like most people, if you say that name, most people don't know who that is. I was mentioning Daniel Shaver earlier, the most egregious police shooting I've ever seen. A white police officer, white victim, totally unjustified. And people don't even know these cases. But I used to also believe the narrative that what was going on in the US with these police killings was primarily and very specifically targeting Black people. Because
You used to think that?
I used to believe that.
Why?
Because that's all you see. Which stories do you hear about on social media? Which stories do the British press talk about? Have the British press ever covered a white American being killed by the police?
He's got privilege, mate. So.
It happens more than Black people killed.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know that, right? Yeah. And so because I could name those names, right? I knew about Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Michael Brown. That one's a different situation.
Eric Garner.
Yeah. Now, I could name these names. Yes, people know the names, and that's what BLM say. Say their name. And so I sort of got swept into that whole narrative, and I thought, okay, this is very, very specifically targeting Black people. And then when I did look at the data, I was like, oh, how come I'm not hearing about the other 70%? That's weird. And I looked into some of the cases. I even watched some of the ones that had videos, and I was like, whoa, how do people not know about this? I was like, okay, this is bigger than, the scope here is a bigger problem than what I thought it was. This is a, state, this is a state violence on citizens issue. This is a police brutality issue. This is a training issue. This is a not having high enough standards issue. It's not simply a racial issue, and everyone is trying to view it purely through that lens. And I think as long as people are trying to do that, I fear that it won't really be resolved properly, because that's not, you're diagnosing the wrong problem. And like I said, I think racism can be a part of it, and it likely is in some situations. But for example, in the George Floyd killing, people jump straight to the race narrative. We don't yet have any evidence that that was a racially motivated killing. And some people will even get angry at me for saying that.
Right.
How, of course, Zuby, it's obvious. Like, what do you mean it's obvious? Right? Just because someone, a white person kills a black person or vice versa, that does not mean it was a racially motivated killing. Could it be? Sure, it could be. But we don't have any evidence. You know, some people say, and then people say, oh, well, you know, he wouldn't have done that to a white guy. I'm like, I've watched a video of them doing that to a white guy. So I don't know. I don't know what's in Derek Chauvin's heart, but the idea that this never happens to white people is a lie. It's just wrong. It's factually incorrect. It's ignorant. And so I think people need to be willing to have that whole wider conversation. If we I feel about this on like every issue. People are so bogged down with trying to maintain certain narratives and fit their own confirmation bias and only look at cases which fit their narrative and just cherry pick things. And it makes people feel good, and it makes people feel like they're righteous, and they can shout at other people who don't want to do the same. But fundamentally, I'm just like, man, we can't have such a myopic view on these issues if we actually do want to, resolve them. We've got to be able to talk about the whole picture and speak about this honestly. The problem with society right now is that I call it emotional incontinence, right? Like emotions just spray and fly out everywhere in all these directions, and we're really prone to overcorrections and overreactions, right? And the problem is when it just swings immediately too hard one way or the other. I mean, again, in the light of this killing, there was a rare moment for like 24 hours where everybody, 99% of people, Republican, Democrat, black, white, even police officers were on the same page, which is actually super duper rare. Some people who are wired a certain way emotionally will take an issue with me saying something like that.
Right.
But they're not thinking logically, right? If you defund the police or you abolish the police, what is going to happen? And who is it going to hurt the most?
It's going to be utopia, Zuby.
It's not going to be the rich celebrities who have private security and live in gated communities and are, you know, it's easy for them to be anti-border walls and anti-guns when they're surrounded by border walls and guns, etc. But for the people who are actually in communities with high crime and in places where they can't afford private security and all that kind of stuff, that's where they need the police. You want the police to be good. You want the police to be good. But the idea that you just get rid of them and that's somehow going to, the criminals are just going to stop because there's no police, it's like, what kind of logic is that? That's crazy. And you've seen this in different places, like when the authority goes, when the police goes, what happens? You get these bands of militias and you know, like vigilantes and stuff, and it's like, look, that's really not the way forward. It's very knee-jerk. And it seems like right now everything's just running on emotion. Everything's running on emotion. And I can understand that to a degree, but as to someone who is very low on the emotional scale, I'm kind of like, look, okay, we need some adults in the room and this needs to be discussed honestly, openly, thoroughly, and we can get to the bottom of this. I think in this social media age, of course, this part of the problem is that there's this rush for people to quickly cast judgments and to get the likes and get the retweets and get the shares by being the first person to just say something and denounce it and probably say something super hyperbolic like, you know, this is the reality of black men every day in America. You can't go outside your house without fearing the police and being lynched. And you see people making these kind of statements normally with a blue check, and it'll have 100,000 likes and retweets, and it gives them some juice. But ultimately, stuff like that doesn't help. It really doesn't help. Because, you know, and it doesn't help the other way either when you get people who are like so pro-police that the police could like shoot someone in the face who's completely defenseless, and they'll still be like, well, you know, this is a statistical anomaly. And it's like, look, that shouldn't happen. There are some things that should never happen. Like a situation like George Floyd should never happen.
100%.
You can reduce those to zero, right? There are some cases, you know, majority of police shootings are justified. You know, I don't like to see anybody die in any way, but majority, you don't hear about them, you know, there were over 1,000 last year, I think, in the US, but you don't hear about them because it was, you know, someone was trying to shoot them, or someone was in the middle of committing a felony or something like that. But yeah, what I miss, this is what I'm all about. I'm about honesty and authenticity. And I wish people would just stop lying. I wish people would kind of just, this goes for so many things. People are not being honest and authentic. The narrative has become more important than the truth.
But don't you think we've come to a point in society where if you stand up and tell the truth on any on a wide range of particular issues, it is not going to end well for you?
Well, I think it will in the long term. And I think people are too myopic with this. This is what I was just, funnily enough, talking about on my social media earlier today, which is that in terms of people silencing themselves and no one, cancel culture and no one wanting to voice opinions that don't toe certain lines and narratives, it's extremely short-term thinking. It's very, very myopic. And it's like, sure, it might make you feel safe for now, but what about in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? People say, but I've got kids. I'm like, yeah, well, what kind of world do you want your children to inhabit? What kind of society and culture do you want them to grow up in? Do you want your children not to be able to express any view or anything in 20 years because we've become so rigid and we've literally got the thought police out there and no one can do anything? No, it's supposed to be a free country. And if you're in a free country that's supposed to have freedom of speech, then people need to exercise that. It can't be taken for granted. I'm sure you guys have faced this before, and yeah, you might get some level of professional criticism or things even in your own family or amongst your friendship. We might cause certain rifts and things like that. But ultimately, honesty is truly the best policy in the long run. Yeah, and it's odd. I mean, there are people who call themselves liberal, and that's how they identify. And I'm like, I am more liberal than you in terms of actually like upholding the value, what are classically liberal things: freedom of speech, ability of people to dissent, to meet and talk to who they want, to not be sort of ostracized permanently for their views or their opinions, all this kind of stuff. Like, there's tons of stuff in the world I do not agree with. There's a lot of stuff I do not agree with, but people have a right to their views. They have a right to their opinions. I would never try to deplatform someone off of social media or come for their job or try to cut out their sponsor because they said something in a podcast I disagree. Like, that's crazy. How can you support anything along those lines and consider yourself liberal? I mean, it's bonkers. And people are waking up to this. Like I said, people are waking up. I just think that collectively, and I do try to give people courage and encourage people in different ways to just be like, hey, whatever situation you're in, if you're in school, if you're at university, if you're in your workplace, just online, etc., just be willing to, even if I don't agree with all of your principles or values, right? Just, you have a right to them, and that's okay to express them. And I'm on your side. I'm on the side of anyone who can agree to that basic tenet. It's really that simple. And so people need to not play the game, right? Just not play that game. If there's words or terminology and things you don't agree with, or someone is trying to redefine the meaning of a word, right? Someone says racist and they're trying to convince you that it means that black people can't be racist, only white people can be racist because racism is now privilege
plus power.
Yeah, it's discrimination plus power. And if you don't have the institute, right, don't play that game. Right? Don't just say, no, that's BS. That's nonsense. That's not what it is. And politicians, right? That's how they get votes, because again, like I said, most people have this herd mentality. So it's easy to dupe people. If you're a politician and you speak in a certain way and you play the identity politics game, then they do it because it works. And I don't know how I can get this message out there, but I'm like, people shouldn't let it work on them, right? If a politician gets up tomorrow and they just start talking all this stuff about people of color and, black people and white supremacy and dismantling the patriarchy or whatever, that doesn't work on me. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, you're just speaking nonsense, right? You're just trying to pander to certain demographics and certain people. And actually, that's what I find offensive. I'm like, I find it offensive you think I'd fall for that. You see what I mean? But unfortunately, a lot of people do. Right? It does work on them. And you get people saying like, oh, well, they said they'll do this. They mentioned my demographic in the thing. So that means that they're their supporter. And I'm like, look, none of us should play this game. And again, if that game can be played one way, it can be played any way. I don't know, man. I'm generally an optimist by nature. I'm generally an optimist by nature. And as I said, I think, 90% of the people in the middle of this, 90% of the middle are decent. This is also why I don't like this narrative of people trying to say that, I don't like it when people say things like the UK is a racist country. I don't, and then people get mad at me for not liking that. But it's like, I don't like that, because you are painting a lot of people who I know are good, decent people who are not racist, you're just saying, if you say the UK as a whole, or like British society as a whole, it's like, well, you're kind of talking about all of us, right? So if that's not the case, then please word your stuff, I'm not trying to language police people, but, word yourself a bit more carefully, right? If you say that there's a difference between saying there is racism in Britain,
right,
and saying Britain is a racist country. Those are different statements. The first one's like, yeah, of course, right? There are racist people everywhere. Yeah. But suggesting that Britain as a whole is racist in 2020 it's damning a lot of people.